Welcome, everybody, to episode 11 of EV Society Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. My name's Tim Burrows, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I know a lot of you are very familiar with EV Society. We also have new people joining us on the webinar each month, and for their sake, I'd like to share the facts that Electric Vehicle Society is a national organization in Canada. We have memberships available. They are, for a full membership, only $30 a year. And if you're a senior, it's $20. And you can join just as an associate member at no charge. You'll be more than welcome to join us. If you do, and even if you don't join us as a member, why not come out to one of our virtual meetings every month? Just go to evsociety.ca for more information. I'm going to give you a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it later or share it. Today's webinar will run for no longer than 60 minutes. And all the guests have joined with the webinar with their cameras off and their microphones muted. You're encouraged to ask our guest speaker questions at any time. And as you probably are aware, there is a Q&A button on your screen that you can use to enter your questions. And I'd like you to remember that you can always upvote someone else's question if you want to hear the answer as well by putting a little thumbs up next to that question. And that just moves it higher on the list and makes it easier for us to pick out the questions of interest. Today, Laura Bryson will take you through the questions immediately following the presentation. And today's webinar is called Powering EVs with Renewable Energy, Capturing the Synergies. And we're lucky to have with us Robert Hornung. Robert is President and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. The acronym is CanREA, the voice for wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage solutions that will power Canada's energy future. Robert represents the interests of more than 250 member companies that are active in the deployment of these technologies in a variety of applications, from the residential to utility scale in the Canadian market. Prior to becoming the founding president and CEO of CanREA, Robert served as the president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association for 17 years, and also worked on climate change issues with the Pembina Institute, Environment Canada, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Friends of the Earth Canada. Robert is currently a part of the Advisory Council of Positive Energy, a University of Ottawa initiative. Hey, Robert, welcome to Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here, and yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you here tonight and talk to you a little bit about renewable energy and its linkages to EVs. So
well, that's awesome. We know that, of course, that EVs are better environmentally than the traditional combustion engines we've all had for years, and we know too that energy from renewables is critically important as we sort of strive to achieve a sustainable future. So leveraging transportation and clean energy is kind of an exciting prospect.
Yeah, and one that I think provides and promises a lot of both opportunities and benefits for Canada and Canadians. So
yeah, great stuff. All right, well, it's my pleasure to pass the microphone and the screen over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll just dive right in. Oops, wrong button, sorry. There we go. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with you here tonight. What I was going to do in terms of agenda is tell you a little bit about the organization, the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, and then sort of provide you with an update in terms of where the technologies we're working with, wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage, are currently at in the Canadian marketplace, what some of the future prospects are for those technologies and what some of the drivers are for those growth prospects, and then talk a little bit about the linkages between renewable energy and EVs and some of the synergies that exist there. So with respect to the association itself, Tim covered a bit of this information, but I'll just highlight that it's a new association. It was formed on July 1st last year. through an amalgamation of the Canadian Wind Energy Association and the Canadian Solar Industries Association. And it came together because there was a growing recognition that increasingly in this space, there are no longer single technology companies. There are multi-technology companies who are hoping to capture the synergies that exist between wind, solar, and energy storage to deliver a more comprehensive set of services and products to customers and to the electricity grid. We have 275 companies now active in the association. Interestingly enough, in the less than a year since we started, about 20% of those companies are new companies, new members who were not members of either the wind or solar associations. So these are new companies coming in, intrigued by the possibility of the synergies that exist between these technologies. As Tim mentioned, our mandate is quite broad. Goes all the way from large utility scale facilities in terms of wind farms, solar farms, down to the solar panels on a residence and a battery in the basement. And our vision as an association is to ensure that wind, solar, and energy storage play a central role in transforming Canada's energy mix. And the last note I would make is just to say that as an industry association, we clearly are advocates for our technologies and our industries, but we're a little bit unique in that we're a national association that probably does 80% of its advocacy work at the provincial level. And that's a reflection of the constitutional division of powers and the key role that provincial governments play in electricity policy in this country. So, little background, where are we at today in terms of these technologies? So Canada is actually the 9th largest producer of wind energy in the world. We often hear about how we're a leading oil and gas producer and everything else, but in this area too, we're also a global leader. And importantly, over the last decade, there's been more wind energy capacity added to Canada's electricity grid than any other source of electricity generation. So it's definitely not niche, it's moved into the mainstream. On the solar side, we're 19th globally in terms of installed solar capacity. And that reflects, again, the sort of diversity of applications in which solar can be applied. You see there on the slide, 40% of Canada's total capacity is made up of facilities smaller than 1 megawatt in size, and frankly, quite a bit smaller than 1 megawatt in size, which reflects the distributed nature of solar, its presence on rooftops, whether on homes, small businesses, commercial enterprises, shopping malls, etc. On the energy storage side, Canada is a little further behind some other countries in that regard. We have about 40 energy storage projects in place across the country. Energy storage itself is a diverse sort of term. It captures a whole range of different technologies that provide energy storage services, differing in the length of time that they can provide those services, whether it's for seconds or for hours or minutes or months, frankly. And Canada has sort of dipped its toe in these technologies across a broad spectrum of the potential technologies that can be utilized. Energy storage is going to play an increasingly important role going forward because of the services it can provide to the grid and because of the role it can play in helping to facilitate the integration of wind and solar energy going forward. And of course, in Canada, we have to mention 60% of Canada's electricity comes from hydropower. And hydropower, because a lot of our hydro is reservoir hydro with large dams and reservoirs behind it, can also play an important role in terms of providing energy storage services. So I've included this map here to give you a sense of where things are at in Canada today. You will see that Ontario has the most installed capacity of wind energy and solar energy in Canada. In fact, the overwhelming majority of installed solar energy in Canada is in Ontario. Wind is more broadly distributed. You see that we've got Ontario leading, but there's very significant amounts of wind energy in Quebec, rapidly growing amounts of wind energy in Alberta. And if you look into the Atlantic region, you'll see some really interesting things there. The numbers look small, but wind energy provides almost 30% of Prince Edward Island's electricity today. It provides more than 15% of Nova Scotia's electricity today. Overall in Canada, these sources provide between 7 and 8% of Canada's total electricity at this time, which doesn't sound like a lot necessarily, but you have to remember that it started from zero not that long ago. And the fact that it's been the majority of new build means that it's rapidly growing and rapidly increasing its penetration into the grid. This graphic here illustrates how that's changed over time. And you'll see that we've seen steady growth, but you'll also see that it's decelerated. We had fairly rapid growth in wind and solar energy between 2010, 2015. And since that point, it's been much more modest growth. And it's important to think about why that is in the Canadian context, because there's all around the world, you see massive growth in renewable energy underway. The drivers exist in Canada as well, but they play out a little differently. So if we look around the world, what is leading to increased investment in renewable energy? Well, one thing is electricity demand growth. We need new electricity supply. In Canada, that hasn't been the case so much over the last decade. Since the financial crisis in the latter part of the first decade of this century, electricity demand, well, that throws you off. I spoke about how on the electricity demand growth, indeed, since the financial crisis in 2009, 2008, 2009, we've seen very limited electricity demand growth in the country. And therefore, it's not a matter of not building renewables, it's not really building anything. We now have electricity surpluses in several parts of the country, including in Ontario at this moment. And so until that surplus disappears, there's not as much of a need for new electricity. Decarbonization is clearly a key driver for renewable energy deployment around the world. But in the Canadian context, it's a little bit different because we have an electricity grid that is already 82% non-emitting. And that means that there are fewer opportunities in Canada relative to other countries to substitute renewables for coal-fired power or gas-fired generation. And that again serves as something that means this transition is moving a little more slowly in that regard in Canada than in other places. Another big driver globally for investment in renewables these days is customer choice. You've all heard of companies like the Googles and the General Motors and the Johnson & Johnsons all making commitments to procure renewable energy to meet their own internal targets. That's a major driver around the world, less so in Canada, because in Canada, the only electricity market where it is possible for a corporation like that to sign a bilateral agreement with a renewable energy provider to secure that power is Alberta. In the rest of the country, a company has one potential supplier, and that's usually a crown utility. So that also is not the same driver in Canada than it is in other countries. And also we've seen, I talked a little bit earlier about solar energy and the fact that solar power has not expanded in Canada necessarily to the same extent as in other countries. We have a number of barriers here that remain to significant deployment of solar behind the meter, on the rooftops. Net metering is available in all jurisdictions, but in some jurisdictions there are caps on the size of projects that you can actually net meter. In other jurisdictions, if you don't happen to be in the situation where you have a roof that's situated precisely that you can put the solar panels on your own roof, it's impossible to do what we call virtual net metering, where you could bring a bunch of potential customers together who agree to utilize solar panels on one roof, which is actually in that right orientation. So these things have helped to slow a little bit the growth of renewables in Canada over the last few years. Having said that, and once again, I apologize for the presentation here in that you're seeing the slides in this way. If I can fix it later, I will. Having said that, although we have seen the growth in renewable energy slow, it's still growing, but slow over the last few years, the future prospects are very, very significant. So as you see in the first bullet here on this slide, Bloomberg New Energy Finance in their annual New Energy Outlook has estimated that between 2018 and 2050, 77% of investment in the global power generation sector is going to go into wind energy, solar energy, or energy storage. And that these technologies will represent 56%, will be able to meet 56% of global electricity demand in 2050. Now, I just mentioned earlier that in Canada, these technologies are meeting 8% of electricity demand today. So this is phenomenal, unprecedented growth. And why is that envisioned? And the simple reason is economics. We've seen stunning cost reductions in these technologies over the last decade. So wind energy costs have fallen 70%. And we've seen in recent procurements in Alberta and Saskatchewan, contracts being signed for new wind energy at a price of less than 4 cents per kilowatt hour. There's nothing that can compete with that. And today, in fact, it's clear that wind energy is the lowest cost source on a levelized cost of energy basis of new electricity generation in Canada today. Solar is still a bit more expensive, but it's actually going on a steeper decline in terms of cost. It's fallen 90% in the last decade. And I've just included on the slide a reference from the International Energy Agency that says that solar power is now more cost effective than coal-fired generation or natural gas-fired generation in all of the world's largest electricity markets. And in fact, Fatih Birol, who is the head of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has said that solar is the new global king of electricity. And that's all driven by economics. And on the energy storage side, it's harder to draw a single picture because there are so many different types of energy storage technologies, but the ones that are most interest to both the renewable energy sector and the electric vehicle sector are clearly battery storage technologies. And the costs have also fallen significantly, 90% in the last decade. That's driven a lot by the tremendous amount of investment in the EV sector to continue as it gains economies of scale, as it grows, as it seeks to gain greater market share. Those technological improvements are driving costs down. And frankly, the renewable energy industry is going to benefit from that because it's also decreasing the cost of energy storage, whether those batteries are sitting in electric vehicles or used in major installations on a utility scale to provide reliability services to an electricity grid. So economics is one reason why renewable energy has a bright future. Another reason is unfortunately a more negative reason, and that's the threat posed by climate change. So Canada has made a commitment to move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It's now joined by more than 120 other countries around the world who have made this commitment, who recognize that if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, this is the level of emission reductions required to get us there. Recently, an organization called the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices looked at 60 different pathways to get to net zero by 2050 in Canada. And the good news coming out of that study is that it found there are 60 different pathways. It is possible to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those pathways, well, all of those pathways rely on a certain set of technologies that are going to be constant and key drivers. And then there are a variety of what they would call wildcard technologies, which we'll see how they go. Not all of them are going to be required. Some of them will be, and we'll have to see how they're developed. The safe bet technologies that the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices talks about include renewable energy, include electric vehicles. And right now, to get to net zero, it's very clear that Canada will have to do two things at a minimum. And this is not sufficient to get to net zero, but it's central to any pathway to get to net zero. Canada has to fully decarbonize its electricity grid. As I mentioned earlier, we're starting in a very favorable position today. More than 80% of our electricity is non-emitting, but we can move to 100%. In fact, Canada is one of the best positioned countries in the world to move to 100% because of our vast abundance of renewable energy resources, water, wind, sun. Canada, the government has made a commitment to move to 90% by 2030 and to 100% before 2050. That will represent a significant amount of new opportunity for these technologies. But the bigger possibility, actually, for these technologies relates in what we're going to do with that clean electricity. So we need to decarbonize, clean the electricity grid, but then we need to use that electricity to help us decarbonize other sectors. Transportation is the one you're very familiar with. because the electrification of mobility is going to be critical in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enabling us to meet net zero targets. And that will provide tremendous opportunities for the renewable energy industry. But it's not just transportation, it's electrification of buildings, for example, through electric heat pumps. It's electrification of heavy industry. For example, in Quebec, we've just had recently the first aluminum smelter that runs on electricity has just been commissioned recently. There's a lot of work going on to look at how other heavy industries can also be electrified. That's going to create a much more significant increase in demand for these technologies. And in fact, every study that I've seen that looks at how do you get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in Canada envisions that we will have to double or more the size of the electricity grid to enable us to meet the demand for that electricity that's going to be needed to substitute for fossil fuels in sectors like transportation and others. So where are the opportunities today in terms of wind, solar, and energy storage? In the short term, investment is going to those jurisdictions where decarbonization is necessary and a priority. So essentially the jurisdictions where we are still relying heavily on coal and natural gas to provide electricity. That's Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. The federal government's passed a regulation requiring the phase out of coal by 2030. In Alberta, it's now anticipated that coal will be phased out in 2023. So there's been significant progress in that regard, and we're seeing all of the other provinces working to meet that deadline. That's a short-term driver. In the medium term, so say within the next 5 years, we're going to see is we're starting to see the electricity surpluses that had been built up starting to disappear as the economy recovers, as we start to move forward with electrification. It's creating a new demand for electricity. So in Ontario, Ontario has recognized that by the mid-2020s, it will need both new electricity capacity and new supply. Quebec has also come to this realization and has indicated that later this year, they will start holding competitive procurement processes to secure new renewable energy in the province because they will need that power going forward. Quebec actually is the jurisdiction in Canada that has the most aggressive electrification strategy to date. They're investing $7 billion over the next 5 years to encourage electrification. And that is creating this new demand that will have to be met through new, clean, renewable energy. In the longer term, as electrification gains momentum, moves outside of transportation into other sectors, that will create new opportunities. And although at this point in time, I mentioned earlier, it's challenging for customers to secure renewable energy in Canada directly, that is changing. We are starting to see, for example, in Nova Scotia, the government has now set up a new program, changed their regulatory framework to enable the sort of bilateral contracting I talked about earlier between renewable energy suppliers and customers. We hear in other jurisdictions, utilities telling us that when they speak to their customers are saying, we want this option. We want to be able to procure renewable energy. And the driver there is, yes, in part, it's to meet ESG goals and sustainability commitments, but the key driver is economics. These companies are looking for ways to reduce their costs. And that increased public pressure is leading to discussions about how we reform regulatory frameworks and markets to enable those customers to have those choices. And that will create new opportunities as well. So what about renewable energy and electric vehicles? Well, I mean, I just touch on a couple of points. I think first off, we all know that EVs provide environmental benefits in a sense, regardless of the electricity source relative to internal combustion engines. But we also know that if you want to maximize those benefits, you want to have the cleanest possible source of electricity. And so therefore, there's a good pairing between renewable energy and electric vehicles because of renewable energy's cost competitiveness, and also because of the environmental benefits associated with renewable energy relative to other sources of electricity generation. And we're starting to see that play out in the marketplace. You're starting to see some of the companies that are involved in electric vehicle charging working to differentiate themselves in the marketplace by affiliating themselves and lining up with renewable energy. Some are working to build charging stations with renewable energy generation facilities on site, for example, a solar farm. Others are working and making agreements, signing agreements with renewable energy producers to have contractual arrangements whereby they can clearly indicate that their power has enabled renewable energy, the power they're using to charge the vehicles has enabled renewable energy to come onto the grid and has therefore done that. So we're seeing more and more of that. And it's interesting, the efficiency of electric vehicles means that although you would think that, as we see this transformation happening in the marketplace and transportation, that this is going to be a massive build out of new renewable energy, it will lead to a build out. But it's smaller than you would think because of the efficiency of electric vehicles. And I've just thrown up a statistic there. Just 2 kilowatts of solar power, or about 5 solar panels, will produce enough electricity in a year in Canada to power an EV that's traveling 15,000 kilometers per year. So there are tremendous opportunities here to sort of see both of these sectors grow together to ensure the best possible economic and environmental outcomes. Another area where we can talk about the linkages and the synergies between these technologies relates to the ability of electric vehicles to serve as a source of energy storage. Wind and solar energy are variable sources of electricity generation. Wind generation tends to be at its peak in the evening and on a seasonal basis in the winter. Solar energy tends to peak in the daytime and in the summer. So that's why these two technologies are complementary, but it's absolutely true that they are variable and that electricity supply doesn't always match up really nicely with demand. Having said that, there's a real incentive to try and capture as much of this supply as possible when it's available because it's so cheap. And so there's an opportunity to maximize the production, and when you have surplus production, to put that into storage so that you can use it at another time. So EVs can play a helpful role in ensuring the more efficient use of renewable energy and assist in managing that variability through the provision of energy storage services. And again, we're already seeing some examples of utilities creating rate structures that encourage EV charging during times when you would have surplus renewable energy production to ensure that that will not be wasted, that it can be captured, that you don't have to curtail that production. Instead, you can say, no, produce, we're going to store that energy. And interestingly, what we're seeing now is that EV batteries, which can play that role within the vehicle, can also, even at the end of life, those batteries can be taken and used to provide stationary grid energy storage services going forward. So there's an ongoing relationship there that's possible as well. The last point I wanted to highlight in terms of renewable energy and EVs is that they're both disruptive technologies. And really what's happening in the electricity sector today is very similar to what we've seen in telecommunications, computing, disruptive technologies coming in and essentially broadening the range of potential options that are available to provide services. And within the electricity grid, renewables and electric vehicles, along with smart grid technologies, along with AI, along with demand-side management technologies, are all fundamentally transforming the electricity grid, because what used to be a very simple grid in terms of we've got a big power station, transmission lines, and then we've got a load that takes it. Now you have the opportunity on both the supply side and the demand side to have a much broader range of technologies that can all contribute to the grid. And that means that we're moving towards a grid that is much more diverse, many more participants, much more decentralized, so not built around central power stations, much more integrated through smart grid and artificial intelligence, and much more participatory because citizens, companies, consumers have the opportunity now to be actively engaged in the electricity grid. So when we talk about that, that leads us to discussions about what happens at the distribution level, distributed energy resources, the idea of microgrids. And EVs can be one part of that sort of ecosystem in terms of distributed electricity systems, distributed electricity generation that can help to build resilience and reliability into the grid going forward. Now, and that's really important because if we're really talking about a world where we're looking at going and getting to net zero, looking to double electricity production going forward, that's going to require significant investment. And to the extent that we can minimize the need for massive infrastructure investments, to the extent that we can ensure that we're finding the most cost-effective solutions available to meet the needs and the services that we're looking for from the grid, the better. And so essentially what's happening right now is that we're moving from a world where we had a transmission system and a distribution system to a world where the line between those two is blurring and ultimately disappearing. And at the end of the day, we're going to want to have market structures and regulatory structures that say, right now, I need this. Who can provide this? And it might be somebody in traditional electricity supply. It might be somebody on the demand side. It might be an energy storage facility that can provide that role. And our challenge now is to design those rules and market structures to ensure we have access to the broadest range of options so that anybody can participate in providing those services, and that they have an opportunity to do so in a way that allows them to be compensated for it, so that there's a true competition and you find the lowest cost option and then recognize the service that's being provided and compensate them for that. And discussions about that, how we integrate distributed energy resources into the grid, are now underway across the country. In Ontario, the Independent Electricity System Operator is holding a whole series of consultations on market reform to consider how this can be done most effectively. The Alberta Electricity System Operator is having similar discussions right now. The transformation is underway, and really what we're seeing is a world where, as in other sectors, technology has advanced much more rapidly than our ability to stay up with it, to keep pace from a regulatory and from a market standpoint. And now we're playing catch up, but there's a serious effort underway across the country to try and do that. Once those signals are set in place and there are opportunities, the investment will certainly flow because there's a lot of capital waiting to be deployed to bring these technologies forward if regulatory and market structures will enable that. And that will ensure that we get to lowest cost solutions ultimately. So that's the main areas I wanted to cover. I apologize again for the challenges here with the presentation, the loss of the internet. I really do feel bad about that. I'm sorry about that, but happy to answer any questions you might have and hope that was of value to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. I think, Laura, if you wouldn't mind, we have a good collection of questions here, and we did lose a little bit of time, so I'll let you have at it, Laura.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'll start from the top here. Thanks to everyone who upvoted some of the questions here. The first question from Eric: how effective and efficient are the new solar shingles? Do you recommend these new shingles? And I saw there were some comments a bit further down. Someone was clarifying if by solar shingles, this person meant the Tesla solar roof.
Yeah, I have to admit, it's not clear necessarily what the technology, the specific technology that's being referred to there is, but I would just say that in all areas, when we talk about distributed generation and solar on rooftops and different technologies, whether it's solar windows or whether it's solar shingles, as we talked about, or solar panels, the costs of all these technologies have gone down. The efficiency of all these technologies has steadily increased. It's difficult to apply a sort of general economic assessment because it will depend on rules like net metering and what you can do with the power and can you be compensated for putting power into the grid and all sorts of other things. So, I mean, it's going to sound like a cop-out, but honestly, the safest answer is the economics are steadily improving. Whether the economics are viable in your specific situation or jurisdiction depends very much on the regulatory framework that exists in that area.
Next question here from Adley. One of the challenges for wind turbines is what happens to the turbines at the end of their lifespan. As they're not built to withstand hurricane force winds, the blades cannot be crushed, recycled, or repurposed and end up in landfills. Although this is a promising form and cost-effective option for renewable energy, how can one tackle this end-of-life dilemma? And again, I think someone commented mentioning or sharing an article about one potential application for recycling them, using decommissioned wind turbine blades as noise barriers.
Yeah, and it's a very good question, because at the end of the day, if these technologies are really truly to be considered sustainable technologies, it needs to be true from a life cycle kind of basis. And so what we've seen in the last few years now is a massive increase in research and investment in terms of recycling these final components as they come through. You have to remember that it's, in Canada, for example, to this point, there's only been a couple of wind farms that have actually been decommissioned at this point, because they're still in the middle of their useful life. But where wind turbines have been in existence the longest, in Europe, on a large scale, is where a lot of this research is underway. And you have actually many, well, I shouldn't say many, but several different options being explored for how you can break down. So the blades as noise barriers is kind of using them, not doing much in terms of breaking them down. There are other technologies that are looking at breaking them down into constituent components and using them for a variety of purposes in roadways and other things. And that work, the pressure to sort of move forward on that work is growing steadily. And it's not just coming from public opinion, it's also coming from governments who are insisting that that sort of life cycle approach is being considered. So there's a lot of work underway in that regard. There's not yet, I would say, one destination that sort of reflects this is where wind turbine blades will go, but there is a lot of work and the industry is very aware of it. The other thing I would say is that one of the things when we talk about the end of life of a wind farm, for example, if a project is being decommissioned, blades are the big hurdle, because most of the other materials from a wind farm can be reused. The concrete, the steel, everything else. What is an interesting option, though, with wind and frankly with solar, is that when these wind farms or solar farms reach the end of their lifespan, the resource is still there. And so it's possible to continue to use that resource. So for example, in Europe, what you're seeing a lot of right now is as wind farms reach the end of their life, they are decommissioned, but then they receive what we call repowering, which is essentially a new wind farm is built on the site. And what typically happens is it will use about 1/3 the number of turbines, and it'll produce something like 3 or 4 times the power, just on the basis of the technological advances that have occurred over the life of the previous turbines. So there are opportunities to continue to use the resource going forward, but it is important to ensure that sustainability on a life cycle basis. And as I said, there's a lot of work going on in that regard.
Awesome. So interesting. Thank you. Next from Douglas Ferrier, I'm trying to power my EV with a solar installation on my shed. I'm estimating 1,800 watts of panels combined with an inverter and many batteries to create a 120 volt connection. I'm looking at powering it about 25% of the time. I already have a level 2 at home. Are people trying this type of setup at homes across Canada?
I mean, I'm certainly aware of other examples of that. I'm not sure I would say that I know of lots and lots of examples, though, of that at this point. And I'm sorry, because I mean, an obvious follow-on to that question would be, where can I point you to? Is there a discussion group or something on that I'm not aware of one, so I can't help you in that regard.
Maybe Douglas will find some people here tonight that are trying it.
Maybe.
Next from John, the average capital cost for renewables is no more than 5% the cost of residential or commercial buildings. When compared to the overall capital costs, why are the building codes not mandating at a minimum the electrical feeds and panels to be installation ready? This would only increase the asset value of properties. Going further, why are solar panels again not mandated in building codes for all new buildings?
Well, that's um, I mean, how would I say this? I mean, we do see across the country a move to reform and update building codes at this point in time. You know, there are voluntary net zero building codes that exist, but are not mandated at this point in time. The driver there is essentially the debate, I guess, between the builders themselves in terms of their arguments about costs, et cetera, but also what they believe the market is willing to bear, I guess, in that regard. And so, you know, we do, I mean, it's a challenge throughout a whole range of areas where initial capital costs overwhelm reflections and thinking on the part of consumers about life cycle costs. I mean, EVs are an excellent example of this, right? Where people are, you can say over and over again that over a lifespan of an EV, you're actually going to save money because your fuel costs are less, your maintenance costs are less, but it's a higher upfront cost. Overcoming that barrier in terms of that that sort of sticker shock that people sometimes have, I think is true in home building and other things as well. And so, you know, the building code is very much a process of trying to drive forward and meet various standards, but it's done in consultation with that building industry, and they're looking to ensure that they're able to maximize their market opportunity, and therefore, really the solution there is education. I mean, in a sense, as it is with on the EV side, in terms of educating customers and enabling then more support for moving forward with these more aggressive codes. And hopefully, I mean, climate considerations will hopefully drive more governments to move forward more aggressively in this area anyways, and to recognize that it's much, much less expensive to build buildings so that they are able to adopt these new technologies as opposed to retrofitting them later on. And hopefully that's where we're getting to in terms of thinking.
And if I could just jump in for a second, that we have some great experiences out in BC with issues relating to this, specifically the determination that building codes sometimes are an overly blunt instrument to curb behavior, and that zoning is sometimes a more effective way to do it. And I think there's been some really valid experiences out there. Now, I know it varies by province. I think how these things are controlled and managed it's different in different provinces, but I didn't want to let it pass that zoning as well as building codes play a role in curbing that kind of behavior and encouraging the right behavior. So I'll get out of the way.
Next, we've got a tough policy question from Carol. What can the Ontario government do to encourage more wind, solar, and battery storage? And what policy/law needs to be in place to ensure stability between governments so we don't go back and forth between governments?
Well, in some ways, I guess the answer to that would be that, you know, is to put in place market signals and structures that can withstand changes in governments. I mean, any government policy can be changed by the next government. So and Ontario, I mean, Ontario is often described as a jurisdiction which is most sort of represented a yo-yo in this regard, with energy policy swinging from one side to the other. But it's not the only jurisdiction where this is the case. It's true in many, many jurisdictions. Right now, where we're investing a lot of our time and energy is in work that the independent electricity system operator is doing to try and create market structures that send signals that incent the types of investments that we're looking to move forward with. And so, for example, I'll use the example of energy storage. Energy storage is a technology that has massive potential. In most market structures, it's impossible for energy storage to make an economic case for deployment because the market rules have never considered something like energy storage before. Market rules tend to think have been built around systems where there's generation and there's transmission and there's load. Energy storage can sort of serve like generation. It can serve as demand, and it can serve as transmission, as an alternative for transmission. And therefore, the sort of market rules and incentives and rates that we have to be redesigned to account for this new kind of product. And that work is underway right now. So there's, there's a lot of, it's a time-consuming process, but that work is underway. On the policy side, I think, for example, in Ontario, we have been advocating to enable virtual net metering and third-party ownership of net metering to broaden the scope of people who have an interest, for example, in being part of projects like rooftop solar, to enable a broader number of participants, to allow greater aggregation. And then the ISO hopefully has market rules that allows them to provide services into the grid. So there's a number of different initiatives that are underway. But I guess to get back to the root of the question, when you're thinking about how do you ensure policy stability from one jurisdiction or from one government to another, it's the million-dollar question. Everyone would agree that policy stability is critical to provide a clear incentive and confidence for investors in terms of going forward. But I don't think there's any way you can guarantee it in our current system.
Next from Valerie. In Aurelia, our hydro plant was told to stop feeding into the grid or they would be charged. How does the mix of nuclear, hydro, and renewables work, especially when there's a surplus of power?
So, two things. I mean, I think all technologies can be curtailed, in essence, right? So when there is a surplus, for example, wind and solar facilities can be told to shut down, not to produce at a certain amount of time, even though the resource is there. There are in contracts provisions that provide some compensation for that, which is helpful. Different technologies have different capacities to adjust to changes. So when you've got a nuclear plant going, when that's running, you don't really want to be turning it up and down all that much. Nuclear plants have demonstrated over the last few years that they're probably a bit more flexible than people had originally assumed, but they're not really a flexible source of generation. Reservoir hydro has the potential to be a flexible source of generation, run-of-river hydro not so much. Wind and solar can be flexible sources of generation in terms of bringing down generation, not in terms of bringing up. If you don't have the resource there, you can't produce more. So, there is a procedure that the ISO will follow in terms of trying to ensure that that it's seeking to secure the lowest possible cost to meet the demand going forward. And again, this is why the discussion we were having earlier around distributed energy resources and things like that is important, because there are new opportunities emerging on the demand side to deal with situations of either surplus or shortage, and to help manage that variability, that are going to be actually more flexible in the end than any of those generation technologies. And right now we have to find the market structures and regulatory frameworks that enable us to take advantage of that emerging capacity. Right now, we're not able to do that as fully as we should be.
One more question, Laura, if there you have another one lined up, and then we should probably wrap.
Sounds good. This one is from Keith. Keith says he thinks the 2020s will be all about wind, solar, and grid scale batteries. What is your view on the various battery technologies?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of work going on in terms of, the lithium ion batteries have seen these significant cost declines. They do have some weaknesses. People are looking increasingly at flow batteries. People are looking at, are there ways to use different components to reduce costs? Are there ways to extend the lifespan and the charging cycle of a battery? So there's a lot, it's actually an area of quite a bit of research right now going underway, and there's a real competition underway in that regard. I don't know who will be successful in that in the end, or how that will play out, but it's very encouraging to see the amount of innovation, I guess, that is underway in that regard. And when when we spoke about the grid scale sort of batteries, they're being deployed in massive scale, not so much here in Canada yet, but in a jurisdiction like California. They're being deployed in a massive way to help deal with some of the disruption they've faced, for example, from wildfires and things like that, to ensure they're seeking to ensure reliability in the grid going forward. But we are also seeing investment in other technologies aside from batteries, because batteries can provide some very, very useful services for a certain period of time. But for integrating renewables, we will need some more long duration energy storage, which exceeds that which can be provided by batteries. So there's also a lot of research going on in that area as well.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, oops, there we go. Thanks, Robert. That was great. It's really helpful to have someone highlight some of those synergies. I think we know that they're there, but to hear someone articulate some of those synergies between our cars and renewable energy, it's refreshing to hear and helpful. Obviously, the growth of renewables alongside large-scale electrification is going to be something spectacular, I think, to see in the coming years, for sure. And we appreciate your presentation. That was terrific, and it's a great opportunity to learn more about that relationship. And Laura, thank you also for taking us through those questions. Very helpful, as usual. We appreciate it very much. And I always want to thank the rest of the webinar committee, because they do work behind the scenes to help us do this every month, and it's deeply appreciated. As far as the rest of the audience tonight, we hope you will come back for the next episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars. And that will be on May the 4th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we're going to hear from Tim Johnson. He's executive chairman and co-founder of Li-Cycle, a company that's working to make lithium-ion batteries a truly circular, sustainable product. So thank you all for joining us on this month's webinar episode. Appreciate it very much. And from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society, and until next month, please stay safe and stay healthy. This concludes tonight's webinar.